Vice President.
Senator Vieira, you have 32 minutes.
Thank you. Before we broke for lunch, I was pointing out that 15 clauses of the bill are about imprisonment, and 12 clauses of the bill impose imprisonment for the remainder of the offender's natural life. The legislation also creates the offense of trafficking in firearms and prohibited weapons, and there's a reverse burden of proof on the accused. So critical to this debate must be consideration of whether increased incarceration will reduce crime in general and firearm offenses in particular. Allied to that as a policy objective, and remember, the Honorable Minister of National Security pointed out that they had engaged in critical analysis and they are critical policy decisions. So allied to that as a policy objective is whether there are other or parallel alternatives to incarceration. Now, for those who breach this legislation, the penalties will be harsh and severe, and they will also be denied bail. However, before confronting the policy objectives and common, undesirable, but entirely foreseeable side effects, I would like to take the opportunity to respectfully commend the following recommendations for consideration. Because we are amending the Firearms Act, and I think that by focusing only on the imprisonment aspects, we have missed certain opportunities. So, for example, background checks on applicants for firearms, I would encourage, should be conducted by independent, certified investigators in accordance with directives from the Commissioner of Police, rather than, as obtains in practice, by the local police stations. I would also recommend that no firearm license should ever be granted to anyone who is charged with a domestic violence offense, or even accused with a domestic violence offense. Firearm users should also undergo mandatory training on an ongoing basis. I think there's training, but it's usually just once. Once is not enough. If a firearm user has children, his firearm must never be within their reach. The gun must be secured in a locked box or a safe which cannot be easily accessed. Now, there is a prohibited list, and the prohibited list includes prohibited weapon means any weapon of whatever description or design which is adapted for the discharge of any noxious liquid, gas, or thing. Well, I would like to recommend that pepper spray and tasers be taken off the prohibited list. There should be a licensing process, perhaps, which will allow for basic training for those who would use tasers, ensuring that they have a basic understanding of the instrument and how to carry it and use it responsibly. And we've heard a lot of talk about no firearms are made in Trinidad and Tobago. We don't manufacture firearms. Well, there's a thing now called 3D printing, right? And I would like to recommend that the definition of firearms should be sufficiently wide to cater for 3D printed firearms made out of plastic and other non-metal materials. 3D printed guns are easy for anybody to make. Once you have the right machine and the software, you just load up the file and you print it out. And it may be impossible to stop someone from making firearms, and these would be untraceable firearms because they're being made at home. When tracing the source of illegal firearms, don't just only hold the little guy with the gun, the Glock. Try and go after the big fish, because he didn't get the money to pay for that Glock. He doesn't have the resources to get that Glock. So you want to go behind the person who's actually done the financing for the importation of firearms. Now, I would also like to echo Senator Hussein's caution about using the words remainder of his natural life in place of life imprisonment. Two reasons for this: the potential breach of separation of powers, and where the legislation effectively excludes the discretion of a judge when imposing sentence, and whether it is also proper to seek to get around Section 69A of the Interpretation Act. Now, we already have in the Interpretation Act at 69A, court to declare term of life imprisonment, where punishment of imprisonment for life is provided for a criminal offense by any written law. The court, on sentencing any person convicted of that criminal offense to imprisonment for life, may, notwithstanding anything contained in any other law, declare at the same time a period before the expiration of which, in its view, that person shall not be released. So life imprisonment is dealt with in the Interpretation Act for good cause. And if it is that we are using a different form of words so to get around this protection of life imprisonment, I would deplore that. I don't think that that is wise. I would certainly suggest that we continue with the word life imprisonment, because you don't want to exclude the court's discretion. Parliament makes laws, but the courts are the ones that really have to be in charge of sentencing. And we don't want to fetter the court's discretion. There are, as we know, at times exceptional circumstances, and so one size shouldn't fit all. Now, there are two other very important points I want to make when we talk about sentencing. There is, in our legislation, a Sentencing Commission Act. And this is Chapter 432. Now, under this legislation, there has been established a sentencing commission. And that commission has responsibility for developing sentencing guidelines and seeking to promote a consistent approach to the sentencing of offenders. And it's worth reading Section 6 of the Act and the other relevant sections. But the point I'm making here is, we are talking about imposing imprisonment and high sentences. Has the Sentencing Commission made any recommendations in respect of this legislation? Has the Sentencing Commission been consulted at all? Because I think under the Sentencing Commission Act, there's a requirement, among other things, for public consultation when it comes to sentencing. There is also, on the separation of powers point, the principles of the Commonwealth Latimer House principles. And if I may, Trinidad and Tobago, as a member of the Commonwealth Association, has signed on to and is committed to treating with these very important constitutional guidelines and principles. And I'm looking at a book called The Commonwealth Latimer House Principles, issued by the Commonwealth Practitioner's Handbook. And it basically says at Chapter 5, the separation of powers represents a delicate balance. The judiciary should not seek to usurp the function of Parliament by judicial legislation, seeking to change the law, which is the function of the people's elected representatives, or by questioning legislation other than on the basis that it is in conflict with express provisions of the Constitution. A principle known as the Basic Structure Doctrine seeks to assert a judicial power to limit the exercise by Parliament of the power of constitutional amendment. But conversely, it says, Parliament should not seek to encroach on the exercise of the judicial power reserved for the courts. For example, by the statutory imposition of a mandatory sentence. Example, Punu and the Attorney General, 2012, 5 LRC, and Seychelles, Mohammed Faisal bin Sabu, VPP, 2013, 2 LRC. So we need to be very mindful in treating with this legislation that we are not stepping over and transgressing the separation of powers boundary by imposing mandatory sentences. Now, even though it is necessary to support this legislation, I must say I do it with a very heavy heart, because it's a sad indictment of the state of our society and the state of our times. We need to pass laws with a cool head. We need to be mindful of the Constitution. And as I mentioned earlier, and I think this has been echoed by many senators, there is concern about the potential impact this legislation might have on young male offenders. The effect of these heavy-handed provisions on young male offenders, I think, is deserving of attention. It is tragic that many of these young male offenders cannot see their blind spots. So it behoves all concerned, this Parliament, government, those involved in education, family members, friends of these young men, and the media, to help our young people draw meaning from this legislation and to design appropriate intervention and support systems that will serve the wider, long-term interests of society. We have to take collective responsibility here. And so, while this legislation may be necessary to protect the public, how I wish I could make our young men understand that they're not only causing pain to their victims and to their families, the families of their victims, but ultimately to them, their own selves. If they don't end up killing one another or being killed by the police, they're going to end up languishing in prison. They are literally heading down a dead end. Now, the legislation is primarily concerned with protecting citizens from gun-toting criminals and giving offenders their just deserts. But containing and disabling criminal offenders are short-term measures at best, and they ought not to be regarded as the only effective means of preventing crime. As legislators, we need to think carefully, we need to think holistically and comprehensively about these issues: guns, increased prison terms, and the effects of incarceration on our young males. Minister Young said it. He said we need to have a multi-pronged approach. But he also said that the philosophy behind this legislation came after long and hard discussions with the police commissioner. And he talked about the approach that government was taken. He said tackling crime and illegal firearms using the police, the defense force, the director of the SSA, a former soldier, all cut from the same cloth. So government is taking a hard approach, and it would seem a military-type solution. Even the language that was used, there's a war out there, no value for life. Well, we have to have value for life. And in the martial arts, they tell you, you can't only go hard, you have to understand soft power. The whole idea about push-pull is that hard works in some instances, but you must also have soft in others. And so we need to step back and look at crime, because today Trinidad has become a land of the lawless. You see people overtaking long lines of traffic on the shoulder, on the wrong side of the road. People lighting bushfires in the dry season in spite of warnings and regardless of the damage to the environment and their neighbors. People throwing bottles and rubbish out of cars. People dumping old stuff and rubbish in drains and watercourses. This has become commonplace. This is our society today. And it's being done by all strata of society. So in Trinidad and Tobago, you could ironically say that law is only for the law-abiding, right? This has to change. So the point is that while this legislation is targeted at gun offenders, if we are to effectively manage crime in this country, all of us need to become more disciplined and more respectful of law and order and the rights of others. We all have to take individual and collective responsibility. I turn now to the issue of incarceration and its effectiveness as a measure towards crime reduction. Concerns raised by Senator Choate and other senators, and concerns that I also share. Putting vulnerable and impressionable young men into a toxic prison environment is likely to decrease, not increase, their chances of building successful lives for themselves. We all know about the deplorable state of our prisons. Justice Gobin described them as hellholes. But what we tend not to think about are the psychological effects and the changes that prisoners undergo in order to survive when they're in prison. Criminologists talk about the pains of imprisonment. So whether we're talking 15 years, 20 years, or 25 years on summary conviction, or conviction on indictment, our young people need to understand that in prison, overcrowding, no privacy, a loss of freedom and the ability to make choice and decisions for yourself. You're living in unnatural and abnormal conditions, including harsh and rigid institutional routines. There's a possibility of recruitment by organized crime, and there's psychological distress, all very stressful, unpleasant, and difficult. And even though young offenders are unlikely to think about the effects of prisonization and the conditions that they will be undergoing, we should be mindful about how they will be shaped and transformed by prison environment, about how hard it is going to be for them to reintegrate back into society when their prison terms end. Because prison life creates habits of thinking and acting that can be dysfunctional for later life, including atypical patterns and norms of living and interacting with others. So on the one hand, incarceration is effective at reducing crime by ensuring that those who are a threat to society are locked up and they're not out on the streets shooting at people or otherwise engaging in crime. But on the other hand, let's not forget the monetary costs involved in prosecuting and incarcerating these hordes of young men that we are going to be going behind. And let us also recognize that prisonization is more likely to increase recidivism after release rather than reduce it. Our prisons are already overflowing with defeated and angry young men. They have been condemned to the toxic environment of our jails, probably the worst conditions in which to try and effect positive change. Senator Sobers made an interesting observation when he talked about, and he pointed out that the murder carries the death penalty, yet the murder rate is still high. So is it unreasonable for senators to wonder, for senators to ask whether we may have too easily have given up on our young men, whether society may not ultimately be losing out in the long term, and whether there are other options? Government, and by extension this Parliament, should not be a one-note Johnny. This legislation may be necessary and it may be deserving of support, but we cannot afford to be one-dimensional when managing crime. Where possible, our young men need a chance to mature out of their tendency to get involved in crime. Prison must not be the only option. We need interventions that can help young men who are most at risk to transition to law-abiding adult lives. Locking people up shouldn't be the only song in our repertoire. So in tandem with these harsh measures that are being imposed, I would respectfully urge government and the powers that be to have countervailing systems and measures in place. Some suggestions might be how to channel their youthful energy into sport, culture. We have the Commonwealth Games coming up in 2021. Let's go on a drive. Let's get these young men excited, get them to use their competitive energy in a healthy way. What about revisiting the apprenticeship scheme? What about revisiting national service? If you're not in full-time employment or you're not being educated. Let's give you some discipline. Let's give you some life skills. Public protection is an important objective of the justice system. And prison may be a justifiable response given the current crime situation. But in focusing on short-term public safety, we as lawmakers should be careful not to inadvertently increase the social cost of crime committed by today's young offenders over the long term. No one wants to compromise public safety in the short term, but simultaneously, we should seek to deflect young people from a potential life of crime by introducing systems and measures which will better prepare them for conventional adult roles and as good and productive citizens. We need to come down hard, but we also need to understand soft power. A multi-pronged approach, the multi-pronged approach recommended by Minister Young, is what I also recommend. And with that, I thank you.
Senator Cummings.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President, for the opportunity to make a short contribution on the Firearms Amendment Bill 2019. Before I proceed with my contribution, Mr. Vice President, I wish to take a minute to pay tribute to former Prime Minister, now deceased former Prime Minister Patrick Manning. Today marks the 3rd anniversary of his death, and we will always remember him for his selfless contribution to Trinidad and Tobago and his vision for the development of our country. Mr. Vice President, I must express congratulations to the Honorable Attorney General and his team, who have been very consistent in their approach to dealing with the problems that plague our criminal justice system, and in terms of updating our laws in a way that will send a strong and clear message to the criminals who have decided to terrorize the citizens of this country. Because, Mr. Vice President, we have seen and we have participated in a suite of legislation designed to treat with what I've just expressed. Because, as expressed by my goodly colleague from the other side, crime is a problem for all of us in Trinidad and Tobago. Indeed, crime is a problem for members of the opposition as well. But it saddens me, and I'm sure many citizens of Trinidad and Tobago, that the opposition seems to play a lot of politics with crime. Measures that they would have brought to this parliament, even while they were in government, now that they're in opposition, they have moved away, I don't know, from what their position was. So I want to suggest to some of them that maybe, young senators like Senator Hussain, whom I'm quite impressed with at times, can probably take a cue from your colleague in the other place and vote for what is right for Trinidad and Tobago. This government will not politicize crime. The crime that we experience affects all of us, and we will not attempt to score cheap political points on issues that affect us now and that will affect our children in time to come. Many lives have been lost prematurely. Many wives are without husbands, children left fatherless, and many citizens have suffered at the hands of the criminal element in this country. Mr. Vice President, if the opposition will do nothing about it, this PNM government intends to do something about it. I recall some years ago that a business that I'm involved in, I closed up for the night and I was on my way home. And I stopped at what some will call a watering hole to have a beverage. To have a beverage. Hot chocolate. And while at this business place, a young man who is known to me approached me to ask me to buy him a drink. This is common in places like these. So I was kind and I bought him a drink. So he proceeded to question me, so you closed up for the night? I said, well, yes. And you're on your way home? I said, yes. I did not realize at the time that he was gathering information for what was to come after. The next morning, the police called me very early that the business place had been broken into. And I rushed up there and proceeded to look at my CCTV footage. And Mr. Vice President, the very young man who I bought the drink for the night before, the hot chocolate, as someone said, was walking through the business place, rummaging through everything with a pistol in hand and taking as much as he could. And if, as usually was the case, that watchman that usually slept in there, I don't remember why he was not there that night. But I could only imagine what would have taken place if the watchman had been present there and then. If the criminals walk into a business place, Mr. Vice President, with a tambourine whip or guava whip, as some of us who would remember from our primary school days, I don't think you're allowed to do that anymore. All right? But I remember my hands being turned like this and getting some serious guava whip. For one reason or the other. I was usually a good boy at school, so it wasn't very often. But if a criminal walks into a business place with a guava whip or a tambourine whip and announces a hold-up and says, give me all your money, I don't think that he would be very successful at his plight. But what we have and what we are experiencing, Mr. Vice President, is guns galore in Trinidad and Tobago. Almost any criminal who wants to get access to a firearm can do so, and can do so very easily. And the statistics will show it. And this is only reported instances. In a 5-year period, 4,215 offenders. Can you picture what that is out there? And this represents only those cases that were detected and arrests made. So could you imagine for the undetected situations, how many guns, illegal guns, out there on the streets? A friend of mine, their son committed suicide recently. They're still trying to deal with that situation. Shot himself. Young man, early 20s, a very sad situation. Well, what came as a shock, number one, is that he shot himself. Number two is that he was able to put his hands on a gun very easily. It was not his father's licensed weapon that he used. So that it tells us that we have a situation that goes above politicking. It is a time for the opposition to rise to the occasion and to demonstrate to Trinidad and Tobago that this is not just about scoring cheap political points. This is not about attempting to win an election. This is about making sure that this place we call home, a previous speaker referred to it as paradise. This place that we call paradise, that we all do the responsible thing to make the criminals know that in this country that we all love, we will not allow you to turn it into the wild, wild west. Mr. Vice President, I looked at the news some time ago, and I want to get the name. A young woman in her 30s. Yes, here it is. Her name was Candy Ann McIntyre. And the Guardian newspapers of Tuesday, the 18th of June, woman shot dead after son's graduation. A 12-year-old boy screamed in agony as he hugged his mother's dead body after gunmen shot her in Santa Cruz on Tuesday. Candy Ann McIntyre, 36, whose testimony led to the conviction of 3 men for murder, had moments before attended her son's graduation at a nearby event center and was waiting on her husband to pick her up. A son lost his mother. A husband lost his wife. A community in grief, and the family mourns. And in true opposition style, the elected official opposition turns a blind eye to legislation that could help take some of these criminals off the street. And yes, it is not that this, somebody said it before, so at the risk of being accused of repetition, but it's not that this single item of legislation will treat with the whole problem. But we don't sit back and say we will do nothing until we get the perfect magical response. Crime will not go away by waving a hand or by transferring responsibility. And the government, as a responsible government, and I must say, led by a responsible Prime Minister and a hard-working Attorney General, this government has been bit by bit putting, improving, and getting us to a place where we can all feel safe and push the criminals way out into the ocean. What have we witnessed, Mr. Vice President? Because this piece of legislation is intended to send a clear and strong message to the criminals. It is intended to increase the fines for certain offenses, because it is known and tested that penalties act as a deterrent to crime. So that where at clause 4, the existing penalty for a person carrying a firearm or ammunition in a public place is 40,000 upon summary conviction and 8 years imprisonment. Under this bill, that fine will increase to $250,000 and a term of 10 years imprisonment. So that it is a clear message for those who feel that they can worm their way through with appropriate legal representation, and find themselves back on the street, so that we have a situation where, Mr. Vice President, over the 5-year period, 2013 to 2018, we had 202 repeat offenders. And if you attach to that statistic the amount of lives that would be lost for those crimes that are categorized as murder, then we may have been able to save some of those lives if we had improved legislation such as what is before the House today. So at some point, we have to ask ourselves, we have to put ourselves in the place of the victims. Because sometimes when the crime is too far removed from us, we might be reading about it, we might be looking at it on television, but when it comes close to home, then we understand that something has to be done about it. So I ask all my colleagues in this chamber today, including these young, responsible senators on the opposition bench, led by the Honorable Senator Wade Mark, of many years' experience, to do what is right for Trinidad and Tobago. Senator Hussein, do what is right for Trinidad and Tobago. The only political fallout might come is that you may not get a safe seat. But you know what? The citizens of Trinidad and Tobago.
The rise on 46-1 and also, 46-1, please, Mr. Vice President. Relevance. And 53-1B, TDS repetition. Senator, continue, please.
I will not take back my compliment. I did say sometimes. I qualified it. I know it is a strategy to try to break the trend of thought, and you may have succeeded, but only for a very short time. This bill, Mr. Vice President, is intended to treat with a situation where there are those in our society today who feel that they can hold us to ransom. You go into some communities, Mr. Vice President, and the community is under siege. I understand, I haven't experienced this personally because I'm from central Trinidad, the paradise of the paradise. But I understand that in certain areas in Trinidad that you cannot, there's almost a self-imposed curfew. One street cannot venture into the other street. It's not because they're waving feathers, as someone said in an interview some time ago. Members of the opposition, it is not because they are using tambron and guava whip. It is because people fear for their lives, because the gun is a deadly weapon. No amount of barjonism and bad talk and old talk and gangsterism without the gun is going to be effective. In my village where I grew up, maybe once every few years there was an incident of some cutlass-wielding person that the police had to arrest. And that was a big crime in those days. Now the cutlass is no longer the weapon of choice. The gun is. So if we sit back and we do not take action, the situation is just going to get worse. And who are we going to hold responsible? When we, elected or selected, as the case may be, with the responsibility to put things in place with the necessary caution. I did hear some comments coming from the independent bench that gives some suggestion that I'm certain the Attorney General will look at favorably. Because we do have some civic-minded, patriotic citizens in Trinidad and Tobago who serve us. And then there are those. And then there are those who don't understand the responsibility. Mr. Vice President, I understand, while doing some research into this matter, that there's a gun rental arrangement, that if you can't afford to purchase it, just as you would rent a car to go on a weekend holiday, that if you, in the criminal empire, if you have a work to put down, that you can rent a firearm and ammunition. Well, I don't know about the ammunition part. I don't have the details, but I understand, I was told that that is something that happens. Some people have made that a business. So the state has to respond. When chaos is developing, the state has a responsibility to respond, to set it straight, to bring things back in order, and that is what this bill, the Firearms Amendment Bill 2019, is all about. It is not about trying to lock people up for the rest of their lives. It is saying, listen, you are using a deadly weapon against other law-abiding citizens, and we will have none of it. If you are caught with it, you are going to face the full brunt of the law. If you are a repeat offender, you are going to have increased penalties. And if you reoffend for a third time, you face the possibility of life imprisonment for natural life. And certainly, Mr. Vice President, I think that this is a step in the right direction. Mr. Vice President, if you interfere with illegal guns, you face the penalties. The guns are the fuel for the gang warfare that's taking place in Trinidad and Tobago. The gun is the major weapon of choice in all the murder cases. The gun is the tool utilized by the criminals in all major robberies. Home invasion, carjacking, kidnapping, all of these drug-related crimes, the guns are involved. And therefore, all that we are saying today to the opposition, to the independent bench, and to Trinidad and Tobago, the time has come for us to take serious action against the criminal element who have been taking advantage of law-abiding citizens year after year after year. I urge all of my colleagues on all sides to give full support to this piece of legislation, and I look forward to my colleague Senator Hussain voting for this bill when the time comes. Thank you.
Senator Obika.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Senator Cummings stated that the opposition opposes. I wish to inform the government, Senator, Mr. Vice President, through you, that it is only when bad law is brought to this parliament that they will find opposition. Because as a responsible party and incoming government of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago, we would only want proper legislation to be placed on the law books of this republic. Senator Cummings spoke about attempting to score political points and sounded, however, on his own, for his own part, as if he were campaigning. But I want to inform Senator Cummings that there is a saying, after election, no campaign, time to work. So this Senate is not the place to campaign. The PNM regime has failed to address crime, and no amount of finger pointing at opponents, political and in civil society, will fix the problem. After election, no campaign. The PNM regime, once more, are claiming they are doing their work. The Minister of National Security came and said they're doing their work, but their failure to give resources to the TTPS, Mr. Vice President, in their failure to give resources to the police service. You see the police commissioner coming and complaining, lack of resources. Funding has been approved by this parliament and he's not receiving it. The government, instead, in response, is seeking to engage in public relations, PR, that only sounds like political campaigning to the police officer who is lacking the boots, the guns, and all the other paraphernalia that you've heard in this debate. After election, no campaign. The PNM is coming, Senator Cummings is saying, do the right thing, do the right thing. We are saying, Mr. Vice President, with respect to this piece of legislation, they must do the right thing. But instead, political PR, after election, no campaign. There are many questions that arise in this bill. Many questions that were raised before. Recidivism has arisen. I would expand on that in my contribution. Separation of powers has arisen. Juvenile offenders and their peculiar circumstances arose, a point which I will leave for later contributors. The government would have assisted the debate if when their respective contributors arose to give light to any of the issues that we find that there is darkness on in this piece of legislation. The government would have assisted this debate and the lawmaking process if they would have sought to answer some of those questions, Mr. Vice President. If they had sought to answer the questions raised by Senator Vieira on recidivism, if they sought to answer the questions raised on juvenile offenders, raised by Senator Thompson-Ayi, raised by Senator Vieira as well, raised by senators on our side, but instead political platitudes. After election, no campaign. So the Firearms Amendment Bill, Mr. Vice President, 2019, what is the purpose? What is the purpose that has brought us here over 2 calendar days? To create offense of trafficking in firearms or prohibited weapons. Increase the penalties throughout the act. In some instances, to provide increased penalties for first, second, and third convictions. And provide that penalties for summary conviction or conviction and indictment be increased significantly. Now, Clause 3 of the bill, Mr. Vice President, seeks to amend Section 6 of the Firearms Act to provide for such increased fines and sentencing. There appears to be no discretion on duration of incarceration upon sentencing, which may be consistent with other jurisdictions. But then we still have to ask the question, whether separation of powers. That point was raised before. I will proceed on to another. The first main question that I had when reading this bill, Mr. Vice President, was the whole issue of reformation, rehabilitation. The Minister of National Security declared that when persons are so convicted, reformation is part of their process. The problem with that statement, Mr. Vice President, there was no material circumstances offered by the minister that could have satiated the thirst for answers on this side or for any right-thinking citizen as to what exactly does he mean by when persons are convicted, there is reformation in the prison system in this country. Which part of the prison system that persons are trying hell hard to break away from, to get out of, without a court date being called, matters and so being persons on remand for 10 years without even an idea as to when they will get their day in court. Mr. Vice President, even when they are finally convicted, where is the reformation? We've heard of penal systems across the world, and there are varying ways in which reformation and rehabilitation is applied. Where is the reformation? And then we have the Mercy Committee. That seems to be a silver bullet, the Mercy Committee. What is the record of the Mercy Committee? You know? How many persons have been assessed to see if psychologically they are in fact rehabilitated whilst they are incarcerated? How many of those assessments are even done in the first place, contemplated to begin with, done in the first place, and then secondly, what is the mechanism by which they contribute to someone being considered rehabilitated so that such a committee can do its work? Mr. Vice President, I want to submit that by simply claiming that the prison system as we know it in this country is reformative, we will be doing an injustice to the truth. We'll be doing an injustice to ourselves as a civilization in this country called Trinidad and Tobago. It is not reformative. The fact that persons may reform themselves may be the exception that doesn't prove the rule. I'll give a simple example. When I was at the University of the West Indies, 2003, 2006, I was in social sciences faculty. And there was someone who was a convicted felon, I believe. And he studied accounting. And apparently he got accepted. He made the required marks to be accepted to the university. And I'm not sure if he was released when his time came or if he was pardoned via the Mercy Committee process. This is about 13 years ago. I didn't have all the information. It's just the media reports I went on. And then I saw the gentleman on campus after being released. I didn't have a conversation with him, all right? But the question is, after he left, was there any process that matched that, or was it that this person took the bull by its horn and on his own, with whatever little assistance he could find in the system, found his way out? It doesn't mean that there's light for others to follow. So that's one issue. There's another issue where the bill is concerned in terms of the way sentencing is recommended or mandated. And it's a public interest question. When someone is found guilty of a second offense whilst they have already been incarcerated, what is the prescription regarding recidivism? Because the purpose of sentencing should be multifold. Implicit in sentencing a convict is the issue of reformation, as we say. Should it be contemplated that there should be a distinction between an individual who has served his time for the first offense and subsequent to being released, then reoffense? Because this bill contemplates three successive convictions, Mr. Vice President. What if someone was engaged, let's say they are in their 20s or 30s? So I'm not dealing with necessarily juvenile offenders, or even 40s. They ran afoul of the law, and they were caught by arms and ammunition charge, jail, 15 years or 20 years, depending on which process they went, summary indictable. And whilst they are incarcerated, the other charges came up before the court, and then they got secondary and tertiary, so other convictions. So they've reached the three strikes rule, apparently. But they didn't have the opportunity to be first released and then to show if they have reformed or if they have gone back down the path which led them to prison in the first place. So let's say someone was 30 when they were so convicted, and after 15 years they are released at the age of 45. Maybe the person may decide, you know what, I'm not going back there at all. Turn a new leaf. Even start a family if they didn't have the opportunity to do so before. if they already had a family, pay attention to their children if they are allowed back in the lives of their children. And then now, they ensure that they give truth to the whole concept of rehabilitation and reform, and they stay the straight and narrow. Organizations like Vision and Mission would then be relevant to this cause. However, Mr. Vice President, if, however, this person now, as a second and third, and I want the Attorney General to correct me if I'm wrong in my understanding of what I read, if the person has a second and third offense, whilst incarcerated for the first offense, and they are so convicted, would they then now be caught under the amendment which ensures that they are incarcerated for the rest of their natural lives? No. Could the Honorable Attorney General explain why that would not be the case?
Sure. I thank the Honourable Senator for asking a very sensible question. There is no retrospectivity in this law or retroactivity. To do that, we'd have to specifically say so in the law that we intend the law to be retroactive, following from the line of authority in the Privy Council decision of Lienage.
All right, so, Mr. Vice President, I just watched West Indies lose a match yesterday. And unlike some of the persons who played bouncers or spin that they couldn't handle, I would leave those balls to be played by those who are so versed. I simply wanted to ask the question. All right? So I thank the Honorable Attorney General for the response. I will leave the response, I will leave any contemplation of that response to persons who are so qualified. I was at the University for Finance and Economics.
Senator, sorry.
Yes.
Just want to be sure. Your question, because I want the record to be correct. The law is intended to be prospective. Was your question just the subcategory, if you've triggered offense 1, and then you get to 2 and 3, meaning will the 1 count towards a future offense? Because the law in being prospective means that people who have already had 3 strikes, for instance, and are serving a current term, they can't have natural life. But if your question is that you've got a strike 1 and perhaps a strike 2, and those 2 are already there, and then you come for a strike 3, that you can be subjected to natural life, well, then the answer will be yes. So perhaps I just want to be clear that I didn't understand you to be saying for those who are already incarcerated and who may have hit 3 strikes, will life apply? Just for the record.
All right, so thanks for that clarification. So I think it's really the latter. I will give the scenario first, and then you'll tell me if you agree with it. I believe, so for instance, I understand the retrospective part. Today is the 2nd of July. So let's say tomorrow is the 3rd of July. Someone is caught with an offense. They're convicted. Sometime they say they're incarcerated, 15 years. And then during that time, they had other offenses, right. All right? And they are convicted thereafter. And those offenses came after they are sent to this bill, all right? So they are convicted after. Would they now face, what do you call it? Because they may have been out on bail or whatever. Would they now face a permanent? Yes. Wow. So then, there's where I have a challenge, and I hope that as the debate proceeds, we can really look at that issue, because I feel persons aren't necessarily dying. I don't know what is the life expectancy of someone who has been incarcerated for a long time. Let's say an average life sentence of 30 years or 40 years or so. If they live to the 70 as well, then we may assume, Mr. Vice President, that they may be able to contribute to the development of our society. All right? Just as Mr. Wayne Chance has done, I think no one, Mr. Vice President, no one could have done what Wayne Chance is doing the way Wayne Chance has done. It would have taken a Wayne Chance to do that. So I'm saying there is also benefit to persons after being incarcerated and being reformed, coming back into the society and preventing others from going down the path that they went on. So I hope we can look at that in terms of the natural life thing. I have a serious challenge where that is concerned. So I want to continue, and I really thank the Attorney General for that clarity there. I want to continue on to something that is a concern to me, and because it appeared in so many newspaper articles, of which I will only quote 3, I'm sure it's a concern to the national community. And that is the question of migrants and arms connections. And persons always say, when there's a difficult topic, you have to be careful how you approach it. Yes, you have to be careful because it's a difficult topic, but it doesn't negate the fact that you must also approach it. So the whole issue of the impact of the Venezuelans who are involved in crime, they are not a large number, but it doesn't take much to spoil the broth, Mr. Vice President. So, for instance, in a prior debate, I raised the point that UN Comtrade showed that between 2014 and 2016, almost all countries in Latin America and the Caribbean imported some ammunition, though many did so at small levels, and that Venezuela, in fact, even though they did not report any imports of arms and ammunition from neighboring countries, it showed that they actually did receive US $4 million during that period, 2014 to 2016. And we recognize that this is very recent information. So if, in fact, they are recipients of such a large amount of arms and ammunition, Mr. Vice President, the question is, how can we be prepared for this? It may require working more closely, more intimately with persons from the Venezuelan security apparatus, because in Trinidad and Tobago, being part of the CARICOM community, we have an organization, a multilateral organization, CARICOM Impacts, I believe is the name, that deals with the question of security. All right? On a broader level of the Association of Caribbean States, it begs the question, in our engagement with Venezuela in particular, but other countries further afield, Colombia, Panama, and Peru, Ecuador, and so on, that feed ammunition through Venezuela to Trinidad and Tobago inadvertently. What is our level of engagement at the multilateral level with these countries? And I think that is something that will be important for civil society to be aware of, and for policymakers to be aware of. And I think if the Attorney General or a contributor in the debate, and I'm glad the Honorable Minister of Trade has returned, can indicate, Mr. Vice President, what is the communication, the level of communication with multilateral agencies in the wider Caribbean basin beyond CARICOM that treat with the issue of security and arms trade, in particular, how it impacts the arms and ammunition that finds its way to Trinidad and Tobago. So I want to move on to the question of how this has reflected itself in the way the reportage is done in Trinidad and Tobago. So the headlines, Mr. Vice President, have read: 5 Trinis, Cuban, Venezuelan, Nigerian, held with buckets of bullets Tuesday, 25th June, 2019 by Shane Superville, Trinidad and Tobago Newsday. And just one sentence from that article, it says, I quote, police said members of the Central Operations Unit went to a sanitation company around 8 a.m. and found a quantity of live ammunition along with 15 buckets containing spent shells. 15 buckets, Mr. Vice President. 15 buckets, not 15 shells. Can you imagine how many lives this can impact? Another article headlined, "Help us find this Venezuelan man." Monday, 24 June 2019 by Stacey Moore, Trinidad and Tobago Newsday. And the sentence there is, police are asking the help from the public to find a Venezuelan man who may have information on the murder of Evelyn Mata Rojas, mother of 3, who was shot dead at her home in Freeport on June 7th. And the last headline, notorious Venezuelans infiltrate TNT gangs, deadly alliance. Monday, 15th April 2019 by Mark Bassant. And it says, a murderous and notorious Venezuelan gang has infiltrated Trinidad and Tobago's borders, and many of them are now part of the criminal landscape that has intensified this country's violence over the last few months. Criminologist Darius Vieira, who spoke to the TNT Guardian last Saturday, said Venezuelan gangs have been setting up organized criminal operations here and using their compatriots in these activities. It raises a further question, Mr. Vice President. Whenever we are doing a bill of this nature, it is an opportune time to speak to the population, the wider population, the policymakers, to set the tone for the way in which crime will be addressed and fought in this country. So this is an opportunity for the media to get a handle on how we are engaging internally, but also externally. We've heard that when there was the registration process going on, there would have been some translators who were Venezuelan assisting. However, what about the law enforcement from Venezuela? Because a translator is one thing, but I think we could all agree that a translator may not necessarily be versed in who are persons of interest and who are criminals in particular. So what is the level? And I think it'll be opportune for the people to know what is the level, so we can be critical of it. Critical means to see where the strengths and weaknesses lie of our engagement with the law enforcement in Venezuela in particular. Right? So because Venezuela is next to us, and though it has always been, it continues to grow in recent times in terms of its relevance to our social fabric. And as well, that impacts on the crime situation. So I want to respond to something that Minister Young stated. But before I get to that, I want to speak to a simple point on politics and diplomacy. A very simple point. There are 3 points that the UN Comtrade and then the UN LIREC document speaks to. And one is invest in political capital in the creation of a global political will for greater ammunition controls. And I say global, but we can also extend this to within our region at the level of the ACS, the OAS, as well as CARICOM impacts. But we understand things that CARICOM impacts, but really the broader Caribbean basin and the hemisphere. Ensure a whole of government approach to ammunition is done. All right? And we're not operating in silos, and install a culture of restraint when it comes to all aspects of ammunition for production, export, stockpiling, and use. What do we mean by a culture of restraint? When we have so many open borders, we are an island, we are a twin island nation, Mr. Vice President, with many other smaller, sometimes you can just call them rocks, but they are sufficient for persons to bring arms and ammunition to this country. All right? The importance of ensuring we can give the population a sense of what is our level of border patrol and security. The minister spoke to 8 larger vessels. What are their state of preparedness and readiness? And the detail in those answers are more important than the political banter. The detail in the answers is what is missing when this government is answering questions from the opposition. The questions are not for us, they're for the population to benefit from. So I want to go to Minister Young's contribution and give some response to it. The minister saw to allay the fears of Senator Hussein, my colleague, about ballistics. But in trying to allay those fears, did not answer the question. Because Senator Hussein spoke to 2 microscopes. 2 microscopes being available at the Forensic Science Center. All right? And I'm not sure persons understand why this is important. So I just want to give a quick definition. Microscopy is defined as the capacity to match a spent shell or projectile, the part that leaves the shell and doesn't, that may do damage to the target, to match it to the weapon that is discharged. So the process, Mr. Vice President, is every time a weapon comes to the Forensic Science Center, they have now to record the photo, the fingerprint, the microscopy is recorded, so you can know when a body shows up with a bullet in it, or bullet attached to it, or spent shells, you can know which gun generally it would have come from, and you would have had it registered in your database. So it provides for more efficient documenting of evidence. Now, what I'm reading from is a JSC inquiry report, Joint Select Committee of this Parliament, the report of the Joint Select Committee on National Security, second session 2016-2017 of the 11th Parliament, and an inquiry into the operations of the Trinidad and Tobago Forensic Science Center and the issue of DNA sampling in Trinidad and Tobago. And Mr. Derek Sankar, Scientific Officer 3, acting of the Trinidad and Tobago Forensic Science Center, was responding to questions from the committee. And he said that regarding ballistics, he gave some statistics. All right? And the backlog at that time in 2017, around the first quarter of 2017, was 3,155 cases. 3,155 cases. And Mr. Vice President, what Mr. Sanka spoke to was the issue of their personal capacity. All right? So whilst we may say a unit is adequately staffed based on the establishment, that may only be based on the establishment. That is what the establishment may require them to have. But what is the requirement based on their workload? So Mr. Sanka said we have a contingent of 5 staff members, 5 scientific officers in the Firearms Ballistic Unit, 1 acting scientific officer, 3, himself and 4 scientific officers. And they have inherited a backlog of possession cases in addition to current cases. And they are making, and I quote here, we are obtaining a lot of requests via summons, via police officers asking for the cases, via magistrates asking for the reports of these cases to be presented because they want to get the matter on, and a lot of objections are made. The delay is too long, so we are reprioritizing cases to satisfy the courts, so we will process some, and so on and so forth. Mr. Vice President, the rest of the report, it doesn't sound well, doesn't read well, and I think what we should really be looking to do is ask ourselves a simple question. What is the cost? What is the cost to give the Forensic Science Center the resources they need? Because this entire bill speaks to firearms and ammunition. Convictions require a strong and well-resourced Forensic Science Center, as well as the other part that was transferred to the police service. All right? So Mr. Vice President, the issue is we don't know how much that will cost. The government has not told us. We may have to pose a question to ask that from the government. What will be the cost based on recommendations, not the establishment, based on recommendations from the Trinidad and Tobago Forensic Science Center to bring them up to capacity to handle the backlog? What is that cost? What are the details of that? And what will we get for that money? Because when the minister in answering, all right, he referenced that the Commissioner of Police may have erred in declaring ballistic takes years. But then he said that he didn't go to say if it will take 6 months or if it will take 6 weeks. You understand? So what he is doing is acknowledging, by being silent on the time it takes to do ballistics, is that in fact the Forensic Science Center is woefully under-resourced where it comes to ballistics testing. The fact that the minister did not dispel the statement that Senator Hussain raised about only 2 microscopes being available, it means that they are under-resourced in terms of not only staffing maybe, but equipment. So, therefore, the minister is acknowledging there is a failure to adequately resource the Trinidad and Tobago Forensic Science Center. So if by this legislation we assume that the police service are well-resourced, if by this legislation we assume that the police are well-resourced and they can even take the guns off the streets, then what will be the result? If we assume, ceteris paribus as they say in economics, if we assume all being equal, the police are well-resourced and they can take all the guns off the streets, providing this legislation is passed, what will happen is the Forensic Science Center will be inundated with much more requests for ballistics reports and testing and so on. And they're already saying that they can only produce this amount. The minister is saying that if there's a priority, they can jump the line. But that is only for that priority item. The rest may still take the 6 years or the 2 years or what have you. The issue is still unresolved. So I think the government would do the population a service if they were able to even say what is the true situation. Don't see it as politics, as Senator Cummings said. It's not politics. What is the true situation at the Forensic Science Center? You've been in government for 4 years, but you have failed to resource the Forensic Science Center. What is the true situation? And I want to go to that same report that I mentioned from the United Nations Agency and the recommendation on ballistics. And there were 4 recommendations. 1, aim to harmonize automated ballistic identification system acquisition and searching protocols in the region, focusing on cooperation across jurisdictions, setting up of sub-regional centers of excellence where evidence could be processed for multiple member states, and this should be contemplated as a way forward. If the Honorable Minister of Trade and Energy is Honorable Minister of Trade and Industry is going to contribute, maybe the Honorable Minister may have, as we say in Trinidad, a Zeppo from the Foreign Affairs Ministry to give some insight as to what is happening with multilateral work in ballistics. Nations that are already, second recommendation, nations that already have IBIS, which is the Integrated Ballistics Identification System, stations, should continue the region's prominence in the international Interpol network and join as soon as possible. The third recommendation with regard to ballistics. Effective intelligence leads not only to convictions, but also creates broader intelligence for law enforcement and judicial authorities, enabling proactive and not reactive responses. Establishing and optimizing the use of double casting, the collation of small arms submission trends and developments in the effective searching of physical and digital open case files. And the last point, the huge potential will not be fully realized without the investment of political and financial capital into the necessary human and physical resources. What does that last point mean? It means unless you resource the arms of the country, and there's one in the police service and there's one in the Forensic Science Center that are required to handle possession and other cases regarding ballistics. If you don't resource them well, then of course, everything that you do will fail at that bottleneck. There will be a serious bottleneck, as we say in Trinidad, the China bottle effect will be strong. Mr. Vice President, can you tell me what time I'm expected to end? 3:24. Thank you very much. So, Mr. Vice President, in addition to the UN subcommittees, let me just give you the proper name of the UN agency. It's the, I crave your indulgence. The document is Ammunition Control Practices in Latin America and the Caribbean, UN LIREC 2018, and I took most of my submissions from page 9, which is in the introductory part of it. All right? So, and I can share that source with Hansard, because there's a URL attached to it. Now, Mr. Vice President, the Joint Select Committee on National Security, in a public hearing summary, the Joint Select Committee that I referenced, that report I referenced, it pointed to 7 issues regarding ballistics testing and firearms and the process of such. And in particular regarding the firearm user's employee certificate. The first point is the instances of ballistics being used to match the firearm seized by the TTPS in relation to criminal activity. So they were raising a red flag in that regard. The second point is the IBIS system, Integrated Ballistics Identification System, used by the Forensic Science Center and the regularity with which data is entered into IBIS. The third point is the issue of the Forensic Science Center and the sharing of information using the Interpol Ballistics Identification Network, IBIN. The fourth point is whether all weapons retrieved are routinely checked against the IBIS database. Now, that's a very important point. If we are checking, Mr. Vice President, and we are saying that maybe there's a suspicion that because of the addition of foreign fighters, for example, or immigrants who are themselves, some of them are engaged in criminal activity, hiding among the immigrants, and you are matching, you are testing the arms and ammunition against this international network from Interpol, then, of course, you will be able to determine whether or not there's any truth to that claim that the guns are coming from country X or country Y from these sources. It will assist decision makers in terms of how to exactly carry out their policy. Next point is the persisting challenges faced by the Forensic Science Center, including the current backlog of cases with respect to ballistics, the need for more staff, and the need for adequate accommodation for necessary equipment. The next point is working relationships between the Forensic Science Center and tertiary institutions to streamline graduates for assumption of duties at the Forensic Science Center. Mr. Vice President, a visionary line of expenditure was for the campus. I call it the outside San Fernando campus. They say located in Davie, but where it's located, there are no houses there. It's very close to San Fernando. It will serve Point Fortin, Cedras, Erin, Princestown, San Fernando, Gasperlo, Cuba. Everybody will benefit from that campus. And do you know that forensic science would have featured prominently in the Davie campus of the University of the West Indies? That was visionary spending by the People's Partnership Government, led by Kamal Prasad Bisesa. What has this government done? Has the campus opened as yet? We are hearing it may open. It may not be at the best wishes of this government. And this is a recommendation in 2017. Had we been in government, this recommendation would not have had to be made, because the Forensic Science Center department at the University of the West Indies South Campus would have already been up and running, and we'd have less problems to face as a country today. And the last point I raise is the capacity of private firms to perform ballistic testing in Trinidad and Tobago. Now, Mr. Vice President, from the same Joint Select Committee report, there were some questions raised. There are questions raised on legislation. I would not bring that here because that speaks to legislation that should come and so on. But there was some issue regarding the staffing at the Forensic Science Center. And they were asking for employment of at least 4 additional qualified firearm examiners with extensive work experience to deal and eliminate the backlog of cases in the firearm section. Procurement of scientific equipment, including 2 comparison microscopes at a total cost of approximately $2 million. $2 million, Mr. Vice President. $2 million. $2 million is cheaper than the paintings that were purchased. $2 million, Mr. Vice President, is cheaper than the cost they'd have spent to rent Achievers car park. $2 million. $2 million, you know, would have solved a significant problem. Trinidad and Tobago dollars, mind you. So, in closing, I want to say to the government, I want to end as I began. After election, no campaign. Time to work. Talk done. Thank you.
Senator Richards.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President, for recognizing me and granting me the opportunity to contribute in this bill, an act to amend the Firearms Act, Chapter 1601. And let me say from the very onset that I will support this bill. I will support this bill because to not support it will be going counter-narrative to efforts to curtail criminology in Trinidad and Tobago, but not because I think it's going to make any difference, quite frankly. Because to use an analogy, a cricket analogy, which seems to be on trend these days, it seems like we're just whooping wild. You know, our backs against the wall, our team seems to be losing, and we're just going out whooping wild, hoping to connect and hit a 6. And I don't think that is the way we should be approaching the fight against crime. And I know it is one of the measures that the government, through the Honorable Attorney General, is putting in place to deal with criminality in Trinidad and Tobago. But I really think that it has come about to make up for a really poorly performing police service. Because if the police service were performing at the levels it should in terms of prevention, detection, evidence gathering, dismantling of gangs, investigations, etc., we would not have criminals being able to go into the courts or be taken to the courts and they get out on $3,500 bail. And I think we need to be able to really look at what the issue is and as opposed to just reacting wildly and erratically sometimes to try to find the means to solve the problem. And to counter our colleagues, Senator Haynes in her contribution earlier, in terms of her suggestion of the community approach to fighting crime, that also I think is laudable, but one approach is never going to solve the crime problem because we didn't get here because of one reason. We got here because of a confluence of several different circumstances coming together that we have not addressed for the last 30, 40 years, including the social issues that we've allowed to deteriorate families, communities, the education system, which I've spoken in detail about on many occasions, a general sense of inequity in society, which in any jurisdiction will be a catalyst for crime. And Trinidad and Tobago is replete with that. Ineffective law enforcement in many regards, crumbling court system, inclusive of absent really effective restorative justice, and challenges with border protection and international collaborations to deal with transnational crime. So it's a confluence of problems that the many laws I know that the government is trying to pass and amend, and many other systems are being put in place. But it's never going to be one approach. It has to be a multi-layered approach. And you know, in 25 days, Trinidad and Tobago will observe the 29th anniversary of the attempted coup d'etat on July 27th. The 29th anniversary of that dark day in our country's history. And that attempted coup d'etat, perpetrated by a bunch of terrorists, homegrown terrorists, was facilitated by a huge stockpile of illegal guns and arms 29 years ago. And when you think about the intention of this amendment, this bill, we realize that we're really fighting the same wars almost 30 years later. And that's why I said earlier on, I will support the bill with a suggestion for an amendment because of an issue, I think, and that I'll elucidate later on. And I really don't intend to be long. Just want to make a couple of points. To underscore the need for this, I want to quote Newsday Sean Douglas of Thursday, 21st February 2019. 8,154 illegal guns in Trinidad and Tobago are circulating in TNT, according to estimates by the Strategic Services Agency, revealed Fitzgerald Hines, who chaired the Joint Select Committee on National Security, of which I'm a member, and also GSC member Nigel De Freitas noted the police seizure of some 1,054 arms and 18,000 bullets in 2017, and a slightly fewer of each item in 2018, saying people were on a daily basis witnessing the prevalence of illegal firearms in Trinidad and Tobago. And ACP Jason Ford, who was part of the stakeholder group before the GSC, says on average they recover about 1,000 firearms a year, which I get confused with the statistics bandied about sometimes by people making contributions and agencies who are charged with the responsibility of having this information. So there is always a confusion, it seems, as to actually how many illegal guns are circulating in Trinidad and Tobago based on what we are hearing from different agencies. Also, in terms of gun possession and ownership, the TTPS firearms section estimates there are approximately 10,550 licensed firearm holders in Trinidad and Tobago, and about 18 active legal firearm dealers. And this comes from a Trinidad Guardian article dated Friday, June 25th, 2019. Police Commissioner Griffith has assured members of the Chaguanas East Electoral District he's working assiduously to clear the backlog of FULs and making it clear he's not averse to granting citizens gun licenses once they qualify for them. And he's trying to clean up the police commissioner that there's a backlog of over 15,000 applications. So there are 10,550 FULs in TNT, 18 active firearm dealers, and 15,000 applications, which means if he would be able to process those, we could have over 20,000 licensed firearm owners in Trinidad and Tobago. And to me, that is scary in a country this size. And we have to ask the question, are the present laws, rules and regulations regulating even licensed firearm owners effective enough in ensuring that they're not ending up in the wrong hands? When we talk, and we're talking about illegal guns in this bill, but there's also illegal use of legally granted firearms in this country, which I don't think we're addressing adequately. Also, to underscore the issue of the importance of this and why I say I will support it, though I don't think it'll make a difference, and I think it's, as I said, just whooping, as we use the cricket term. Loop, TT, June 24th, by Darlisa Gurlalal. Crime, Griffith, over 50 gunmen linked to gangs. And we all know gangs do use slingshot. So if we know about 50 gunmen, a gunman suggests this person has a gun. And if they're linked to gangs, it's the illegal use of guns. So there's been a conversation in the media in recent times talking about the issue of illegal, or the knowledge of gang members and us not being able to apprehend them. And dealing with the gang issue in Trinidad and Tobago, an article on Sunday, 17th February 2019, Sunday Express, gangs thriving in TNT, and I know the Honorable Minister of National Security spoke a lot about gang activity, and gang activity in Trinidad and Tobago is directly linked to the use of illegal arms. And that report by 2018 report compiled by the Organized Crime and Intelligence Unit, OCIU, of a number of the TT Police Service titled Interim Gang Report 2018 indicated that there were 2,484 gang members in total. Neutral gangs, 103 with 1,144 members. Rasta City gangs, 42 with 589 members. Muslim gangs, 55 with 670 members. Unknown gangs, I don't know what that means, 11 with 81 members, and that was 2018. So there is an obvious disparity between what some people are reporting as the number of illegal firearms and the number of illegal gangs in Trinidad and Tobago, which makes the problem of illegal guns even more complex in terms of us trying to assess whether this bill will make a difference or will achieve its intention in Trinidad and Tobago. In my estimation, I think we're grossly underestimating the number of illegal guns in Trinidad and Tobago. I also want to quote, through you, Madam President, a report, Illegal Gun Markets in Trinidad and Tobago report to the Minister of National Security, technical report as far back as 2008 by William Wells, Sam, Houston State University, and several other writers. And it's about focusing on an analysis of homicide trends in Trinidad and Tobago, revealing the important use of gun use. In 2001, approximately half of all homicides were as a result of a gunshot, and that percentage had risen by 75% between 2001 and 2007. So we see that the problem is intensifying even as far back as that, underscoring the need for measures, I guess, such as these, to deal with the issue of illegal guns in Trinidad and Tobago. But the Honorable Minister of National Security indicated that, well, once upon a time, it was very difficult to get a Glock because it was a specialized weapon, to my knowledge, used in almost CIA, FBI type operations and in areas of war-torn conflict, which seems to be quite prevalent in Trinidad and Tobago now. So the question is, while this legislation is aimed at increasing the penalties and severity of penalties for persons held with illegal weapons, and I much appreciate and applaud the 2-3 strike approach taken by the government in this. The question is, this is focused on possession. And I don't think of the number of persons that the AG read out in the statistics, which I have copies of, so I won't repeat that, in his piloting of the bill, are the persons importing those weapons. They don't have the means, the resources, and the facilities to import the level of illegal weapons we're seeing in Trinidad and Tobago. And I know the Honorable Minister of National Security spoke about locking down our borders effectively and the measures the government is taking. But we have to ask ourselves, and he said that we seem to be making progress, which is to me counterintuitive, of the guns discovered between 2018 to 2019, and the numbers going down. And his suggestion, and I hope I'm not misquoting him, I apologize if I do, is that progress was being made because the numbers were going down. And given what we're seeing in terms of our crime rate, I think that's counterintuitive, and it could just as easily mean that we're being less successful in finding the illegal guns. It's easy to paint a narrative depending on the outcome you want, but I think I don't see that, given the kind of criminality we're seeing and the level of illegal guns that I cited since 1990 and coming up in terms of the reports, that all of a sudden in 1 year we're going to see almost a half, 50% decrease in identifying guns, as opposed to we are less effective in identifying illegal guns and seizing them. And it's all in the context also of how many guns are actually coming into the country. Because if you're seizing 400 guns and 10 and 1,000 coming in, you're not being successful. That's not a sign of success, because it's all extremely contextual. And I also want to stress that we need to be quite sensitive about using the term success when talking about the issue of curtailment of crime and banding about statistics, because I will tell you, and I know Madam President is going to come on me a while to get to the bill, but let me just make this final point. I will tell you, there's a growing sense of a loss of hope in Trinidad and Tobago at the moment. People are losing hope. People are losing confidence that this problem can be solved. And when you're using terms as lawmakers as success by citing statistics, it's offensive to some people. It's offensive. The word success in terms of fighting crime is offensive to the father of that 12-year-old boy who saw his mother gunned down. It's offensive to the families and the victims of the 250 plus people who are gunned down, who don't feel a sense of justice in Trinidad and Tobago. So we need to say possibly improvement, not success. Success means less people are being killed. And based on last year's final murder tool, and the year before, and quite frankly, the last 15 years, we should not be using the word success. Madam President, one of the suggestions I want to make in terms of additions, and I don't know if it can be made to this bill or to the Police Service Act, is since, and in reference in particular to Clause 6 and others, but in this one, to me, it is glaring, and it may be applicable to other clauses, is that a person, and that's 9A1, a person who has in his possession 2 or more firearms or prohibited weapons is deemed to have the firearms or prohibitive weapons for the purpose of trafficking the firearms or prohibitive weapons, unless the contrary is proved, the burden of proof on the accused, and such person who commits an offense is liable. And from what legal minds I've spoken to have told me, this runs counter to innocent until proven guilty. Now the accused is now called upon to prove his or her innocence. And I think if we are going this drastic, which I generally don't have a problem with in terms of persons with 2 or 3 weapons and they having no right, as the Honorable Attorney General indicated in his presentation, to having 1 illegal weapon, much less 2 or 3, or being found on more than 1 occasion, I think we need to put some kind of equal and commensurate penalty to police officers who plant weapons on people or plant evidence to secure charges or conviction, because you're giving a police officer a lot of sway here, as we have been doing over the last couple of months in terms of legislation. And we all know that our police service, though it's gotten a fill-up of sorts with the appointment of the new commissioner, is not absent of corrupt officers who will, on many occasions, and on many occasions have been found to be wanting in terms of their honesty. And I'll quote 2 simple articles to prove that. One is Law-Breaking Police Officers, June 14, 2019. And I'll quote a short part of it. It seems as if somehow, in the most macabre manner, members of the TT Police Service are intent on testing the resolve of their commissioner to keep a clean house.
Senator Richards,
Yes.
you gave the date, but you haven't given the source.
Oh, the source is the Trinidad and Tobago Express online. Sorry. Apologies. Yes. 3 officers were featured on newspaper front pages this past week, having been spotlighted for alleged wrongdoing by their own Professional Standards Bureau. They were brought up on charges of misbehavior in public office, assault, intent to rob, and false imprisonment, and it goes on to give the details of that. Also, on May 21st, 2019, also from the Trinidad Express, take firm action against abusive cops. Within 1 week, the High Court made 2 rulings on malicious prosecution of citizens by police officers who cannot be ignored by the Police Service Commission and the TT Police Service. In both cases, the rights of citizens were arbitrarily violated. They suffered beatings and incarceration. Further, the cost incurred by the state in both recent judgments will be substantial, adding to the costs awarded in all the other rulings in favor of complainants against police misbehavior. And those are just 2 examples in the last month or so about why there's a continued distrust of the police service and why I have grave concerns if we do not increase the penalties, as we are doing here, for police officers who are found guilty of, in this specific case, planting evidence, including illegal weapons, which is known to have happened in the past, on persons because of the severity of the penalties that are now imposed on the persons who are charged with these offenses. So I think we have to balance the equation here, and we have to make it really onerous on police officers, and this penalty should be personal liability, not liability of the state, because it is now a possibility that you could find yourself in a very macabre situation. One of the articles, which I won't quote, involves a police officer who is alleged to have planted evidence because of a personal interaction with himself and another person with a female companion involved. And I think if we are going to be asking the public to be subject to these kinds of severe sanctions, and I know in most cases the sanctions or the allegations will be founded with some sort of background work beforehand, but I am very uncomfortable if the penalties are not equally applied to corrupt police officers, and that, to me, is also something that we need to look at. I don't know if it can be implanted in this bill, or if it has to be put into the Police Act of Trinidad and Tobago to make it really prohibitive or make it a strong deterrent on officers who have intentions or who have an inclination to do that. Another point I'd like to make, Madam President, in terms of the dealing with illegal weapons and obviously the intentions or part of the intentions of this bill, is what has happened in Jamaica. And I want to quote a CFATF Risk, Trends and Method Group report of October of 2016 titled "The Proliferation of Small Arms and Ammunition." And the objectives of the project were to develop a regional report on typologies related to the proliferation of small arms and ammunition and identify the effects that these activities have on member jurisdictions. And there were several recommendations coming out of these, including specific firearms legislation, which is what we're doing here, or we're attempting to do here, special criminal investigation units to bump up the investigative capabilities of law enforcement agencies in all jurisdictions, specialized and specially trained intelligence units, joint task forces, the use of scanners at ports and border and coastal patrols, and that increased random and targeted searches, small arms and ammunition sniffer dogs, and memoranda of understanding domestically, regionally, internationally, in terms of some of the measures that should be undertaken. And we just saw, I think, the first report in many, many years of illegal guns and arms being discovered at the port of Port of Spain after many years of seemingly that legal port of entry not having any breaches. And that's, to me, unimaginable. It's just that we wouldn't find them. The report also goes on to list, in terms of the top 20 of CFATF member countries, of murders by the use of firearms, the top 20 countries, from 1 to 20, with 1 being Zimbabwe and 20 being Honduras. And this report is of 2016, and Trinidad and Tobago falling 11th, with murders per 100,000 capita, 35.3, 77% by firearm, which is not far off what the Minister of National Security indicated, being 81%, I think it was, and Trinidad and Tobago landed at 10th, with the only countries ahead of us being Honduras, Venezuela, Jamaica, Belize, Colombia, El Salvador, Guatemala, Lesotho, and South Africa. So you see, we kind of onerous company there when you think of the problems being facilitated by the use of illegal weapons. Also, in terms of interventions, the report went on to state that CFATF member countries that had been successful in taking illegal guns off the street included, and most prominently, Jamaica, because a court was established by an act of parliament in Jamaica in 1974 to combat rising gun violence. And that's as far back as 1974, because they realized that they had a gun problem quite as far back as 1974. We're now seemingly coming to terms with that. So one of the measures that we may look at enacting in Trinidad and Tobago is specific courts, and in Jamaica and other jurisdictions, they have a tendency to look at it holistically and assign specific dates to gun crimes so that they can expedite those gun crimes through the court system. So that is something we also need to consider in addition to this legislation, through you, Madam President. The other issue I'd like to cite in my closing is the issue of what we can do in terms of firearms tracking. And one of the documents that I'd like to quote is from United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime, Model Law Against Illicit Manufacturing and Tracking of Firearms, and their parts, components, and ammunition. And I'll just praise you because I really don't want to be long. And also, it's underscored in another document called E4J, University Module Series, Organized Crime and Crime Markets, Firearms Tracking and Regulatory Framework. And they both underscore, through you, Madam President, the fact that the majority of guns in Trinidad and Tobago have, for many years, come from Jamaica. Sorry, not Jamaica, Venezuela. My apologies. And the tracking numbers on those guns have consistently said that the large majority of the guns come from the South American mainland, specifically Venezuela. And the local unit has been exchanging information with the regional units responsible for this and have been able to confirm that. So we know that a large number of our illegal guns have come from our closest neighbor in Jamaica. And Venezuela, sorry, why do I keep saying Jamaica? Venezuela, sorry. And it is no wonder that we are seeing a spike now, because we have a migration issue from Venezuela to Trinidad and Tobago that has not been addressed until now, that had been growing for the last 2 years, 2.5 years, coming to now. And well, the state has now responded by the registration process, and the rest is history. And you would have seen earlier on that the Honorable Minister of National Security cited the number of, the percentage, of those detained at the International Detention Center, as I think it's about 80% Venezuelan, he underscored. And one has to ask the question, what were they detained for? He also gave some statistics on a question earlier on about the number of persons who were in remand of Venezuelan nationality. So we are seeing a rise in crimes purported, allegedly performed by Jamaican nationals. And you have to ask yourself if that many persons are apprehended. Sorry? Venezuela, sorry. Venezuela, I apologize, Jamaica. What number of illegal guns, or if it has intensified with the arrival of those persons? You know, and that should be of great concern to us, especially in the context of the acknowledgement of Venezuelan gang members appearing in Trinidad and Tobago and gang leaders appearing in Trinidad and Tobago. So our problem may have intensified, and it was already a very challenging problem to begin with, and we have this new component to add to it. So it adds to the underscoring of the need for this kind of legislation. But again, it is going to amount to nothing if the other elements in the equation are not fortified. Law enforcement doing their job effectively, detection, proper investigation, evidence gathering, to support the charges that can be laid so that this legislation, if and when it becomes law, can be effective. And I'm not hearing about the other elements coming into play or being effective where that is concerned, and that is of great concern. In terms of the issue of what else can we do, I think it's really important for us to consider moving past what I would have described in the past as partisan politics and really putting this country first. I've said it before in closing, Madam President, that if we continue along the line of government versus opposition and a polarized society dealing with this, we are not going to get anywhere. One side cannot do it alone, as we have seen in many instances in Trinidad and Tobago. And with those few words, Madam President, I thank you.
Senator Mutota.
Thank you, Madam President. Madam President, I am honored to contribute to the debate on the Firearms Amendment Bill 2019, which aims to amend the Firearms Act, Chapter 1601. Madam President, there is no doubt that there is a very high level of insecurity in the country, and that there has been for quite some time, largely due to the proliferation and misuse of firearms and their ammunition. Any attempt to rid our society of illicit weapons and punish wanton actors whose actions not only affect members of rival gangs and others involved in criminality, but also make vulnerable all citizens, migrants, and visitors to our country. And here I'm talking about women, men, girls, boys, and persons of non-conforming gender identities. And so any action to correct that which is wrong should be encouraged and supported, I believe. Firearms and their ammunition have become our weapons of mass destruction. And so consequently, Madam President, the measures we adopt and the laws we enact must not merely be reactive, but must seek to address the root causes of the presence of the large cache of illegal arms which end up in the hands of those involved in criminality who perpetuate homicides, gender-based violence, and other dastardly acts with firearms. The question which arises most poignantly is where these weapons, these firearms, originate. As has been said before, Trinidad and Tobago is not a manufacturer of these weapons, nor is it, by global standards anyway, a large importer of armaments. And yet, firearms have become the weapon of choice for those involved in criminal activities who commit egregious crimes and very often, to put it mildly, enjoy impunity at the expense of peace and justice. Therefore, this Senate must seek to ascertain whether the measures outlined in the bill before us are adequate to bring about the type of sustained relief we require as a nation after being, and here I want to use our language of resistance, Madam Speaker, after being under the gun for far too long a period. Trinidad and Tobago has in the past, and I sincerely hope that it still appertains now, recognized that the illicit trade in small arms and light weapons are transboundary in nature and are linked to other cross-border crimes, including the illegal drug trade and human trafficking as a result, and that it requires collective action at the multilateral level to assist us in curbing this menace. It is this situation, Madam President, that led to Trinidad and Tobago being among one of the strongest advocates for and architects of the United Nations Arms Trade Treaty, for which the country was recognized at the United Nations for its sterling contributions to the negotiation and the adoption of this landmark treaty, which I will return to later in this presentation. Madam President, I have examined the clauses of the Firearms Amendment Bill.
Just Would the senator whose device just went off please leave the chamber? You can return in 5 minutes' time. Continue, Senator.
Thank you, Madam President. As I was saying, I have examined the clauses of the firearms of this bill, and in the main it addresses matters related to increases in penalties for various offenses under the Firearms Act. I've also noted as well Section 6, which introduces Clause 9A, creates the offense of trafficking of firearms or prohibited weapons by providing that a person who has in his possession 2 or more firearms or prohibited weapons commits the offense of trafficking, and so on. The bill, however, Madam President, I respectfully submit, does not produce the type of legislation which would tackle comprehensively the illegal arms trade or reduce violence and murders in our streets. A perusal of clauses 7 to 28 of the bill also reveals that the objective of the drafters of the bill is to increase penalties and imprisonment for offenses committed under the Act in the hope that it would serve as a deterrent to current, potential, and future criminality intended to promote the business of the illegal arms trade and perpetrate violent crimes. This bill, however, as well-intentioned as it is being presented, would not be sufficient in order to bring relief to the collective psyche of our wounded society. The bill is too one-dimensional. Even in its alignment with the bail bill and the anti-gang legislation, it remains insufficient. It is evident, Madam President, that in addressing the perverse illicit trade in arms, which have the potential to inhibit our ability to achieve the UN 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development and their targets, that we must not be one-dimensional in our approach as a country. And I want to acknowledge the declaration by the Honorable Minister of National Security that it is a multi-pronged approach that the government is really attempting to introduce. We need more than an increase in fines and imprisonment, or to use the language of resistance again, a lock-up bill, which this bill is all about, in an effort to combat the scourge of illegal weapons in the hands of too many of our youth who themselves are hapless victims being preyed upon by the larger players with their cross-border connections who are involved in the nefarious illicit arms trade, but who remain largely under the radar. And so perhaps, Madam President, it is going to be useful for me to declare who I am, because who I am is who I am. I am Laventille people. And I return again to my language of resistance. That is where my navel string is buried. And so consequently, I believe that I belong to the people of Laventille, and by extension, the people of East Port-of-Spain. And therefore, when I see legislation with language about imprisonment for the remainder of his natural life, it scares me and it makes me lean in to mind my business. Because we also know that get tough policies and legislation very rarely ever focus on and target the more privileged within our society. So I can see a direct relationship between the situation in communities of East Port-of-Spain and this bill impacting our young men and any and everybody else who may happen to be in close proximity. And that is quite alarming. But I think what is happening here, Madam President, is that the murder and the mayhem, which is our collective experience on a daily basis, is a shame which we wish to distance ourselves from, as we fear that all that we have done and all that we have failed to do is now haunting us and challenging the legitimacy of a republic which has evolved out of violence. And so we turn to the get tough on crime approach to ensuring political stability, economic growth, social order, and maintaining our credibility among the nations of the world. And so I want to say, Madam President, that there's a paucity of information provided in the justification for the amendments before us. I am of the view that Trinidad and Tobago has expended too much and for too long on efforts which the population was promised would end our gun violence woes for us to simply accept that because of the increase in reports of offenses and seizures of high-powered weapons, as articulated by the Honorable Attorney General in his opening statement, and of course a galloping murder rate and that the panacea for ending gun violence is the amendments before the Senate today. What, for example, is the thinking behind arriving at the fines in this bill? I recognize that this bill is one of a suite of bills intended to manage crime, all with a common characteristic: incarceration. I think the argument about the categories of offenders minimizes the impact which the increase of penalties can potentially have on families that have to find these funds. The Honorable Attorney General presented statistics about the types of firearms that the police are confiscating. And I wonder if it would not have been useful to, at the same time, provide us with some analysis of why the proliferation of high-powered guns at this time. Some other questions also need to be answered. For example, what turnaround can we expect to see as a result of the introduction of these amendments, and when? The Honorable Minister of National Security, in making his contribution earlier today in this debate, said to us that he promised that we will see some impact, some change. When would that happen? How have the supply and demand crime prevention strategies of the last decade, for example, positively impacted citizen security? And I can relate to the frustration coming from the government bench as ministers and contributors, senators, speak to that level of frustration that all is being done and that the government can't wait until they fix the judiciary and they fix the forensics, et cetera, but that something has to be done now because, in the words of the Minister of National Security, we're at war. I hear that, I can see it, I can relate to it. But I think it's also important for government to also recognize that there are those of us who've been at this for a really long time. And so we've seen it all, we've heard it all, and it has played out in the very same way consistently, bringing with it the same lack of results. And therefore, that is our frustration. The Honorable Attorney General made the point that the majority of guns come from the global north. And I wonder if the Honorable Attorney General could not have elaborated on this statement by explaining if there is some diversion taking place during arms transshipment through Trinidad and Tobago, because the Honorable Attorney General actually used the word transshipment. This, Madam President, is a very important matter as it speaks to issues related to border security, diversion, and the global trade in arms and ammunition. The relevant legislators should bring to this House in the shortest possible time, because it is not included in this bill that is before us, draft legislation aimed at addressing the diversion of arms which the literature and research show is the principal means by which those involved in criminal activities obtain their weapons. My point is that on one end, this legislation is designed to commit someone who is convicted of gun crime to spend the rest of their natural life in prison, and yet we remain unclear about the extent to which external sources are contributing to our demise. And equally important, I think really important, is the extent to which the effectiveness of the state interventions to protect the population from gun violence have been successful. Trinidad and Tobago is a signatory to the United Nations Programme of Action on Small Arms and Light Weapons, which seeks to prevent, combat, and eradicate the illicit trade in small arms in all its aspects. And that is, for example, the amendments in this bill are covered by a global political instrument. And yet, Trinidad and Tobago is not reporting on the measures it has taken to prevent, combat, and eradicate the illicit trade in small arms and light weapons. Trinidad and Tobago's last report was in 2016, and I want to ask the Attorney General, he may not be aware that we've not been reporting, and if it is at all possible for him to help us understand why we've not been reporting and when we can expect our reports to be submitted. Thank you, sir. So it is insufficient to represent these amendments as the be-all and end-all, and that has been said in this chamber several times today. It can't be the be-all and end-all of our troubles. If we are to have faith that these amendments can bring us relief, then we need a more comprehensive explanation and justification for why these amendments are before us, because it is an overly simplistic expectation that an increase in fines and incarceration is going to reduce or prevent gun crime. In the Newsday dated January 11, 2019, a story written by Ms. Nalini Silal stated that, and I'm quoting here, the police commissioner, Gary Griffith, has ordered an audit into all firearms and ammunition seized by police over a 20-year period. He has also instructed that the audit be extended to ensure account for all TTPS guns and ammunition. He said over the past 2 decades, police have seized over 15,000 illegal guns, and he wants to know if those guns were destroyed or noted as part of police exhibits. I wish to raise the issue of stockpile management, and so why do I want to raise this matter in a debate on the Firearms Act? So the new clause that is being introduced, 9A, talks about transferring, in the Principal Act, it refers to offenses relating to selling or transferring firearms and ammunition. And 9A, the new clause that is being introduced, is referring to trafficking. But I go back to my earlier point about to what extent government may be complicit in the demise that we're experiencing. What if there is leakage from government stockpiles? What if there are lax procedures for disposal? How does this bill address those matters? And perhaps the government may argue that this bill should not address those matters. But I think it should. Because in a Trinidad Guardian article of July 1st, written by Mark Bassant, there was a very curious story in which the police got information. This is what the article says. The police got information about arms and ammunition at a particular location, and when the TTPS carried out a search, spent shells and 12 live rounds were found on the premises. The newspaper further reported, and I'm quoting what it said, what the article is quoting, an employer saying, a senior employee told police that the company had been contracted to retrieve and dispose of the bullet casings from the shooting range in Chagaramas. The senior employee also explained to the Central Division officers that the company had been contracted to transport the shells to its premises where they would be sorted and incinerated. So are we to assume that the TPS had knowledge that the 12 live rounds were also collected? I submit that there must be concomitant accountability by government when it seeks to impose as serious a penalty as incarceration for the rest of one's life. The question of the extent to which the state is complicit, through negligence or otherwise, in the proliferation and misuse of firearms and ammunition should be addressed. And so I wish to return to my position on the ineffectiveness of the get tough on crime approach. And I want to share from an article which I pulled, which I pulled from a piece from the Ohio Wesleyan University. And it's an article written by Professor of Philosophy, Ms. Shari Stone Mediatore, and she's offering an analysis of the management of public safety in the United States, and she argues, and I'm quoting here, since the 1970s, public safety in America has been pursued through tough on crime policies. That is, stiff criminal codes, long prison sentences, laws that facilitate police search and seizure, laws that make it more difficult to challenge a wrongful conviction. But studies do not show that tough on crime policies have improved security. The article goes on. The American image of the monster criminal has a specific history. The notion of essentially malignant beings who stand opposed to respectable society has roots in the 19th century criminologist Cesare Lombroso, who used now discredited notions of racial and sexual difference to theorize the criminal man. The article further says, politicians found it useful to raise the specter of the criminal to promote an agenda of aggressive incarceration that served both to detract attention from social problems and to control disgruntled social groups. And so I return to my question. Why are these amendments before us? We cannot counter violent crime by incarcerating more people for longer periods of time. Legislation such as this is wrongly based on the assumption that persons conduct a cost-benefit analysis when they commit crime. And if you simply increase the penalty, they will not commit the offense. Of course, we know quite differently by now. But gang involvement, and in this case, firearm possession, are social issues. And this approach does not address the risk factors to gang involvement and subsequent firearm possession. A public health approach would be my preference, restorative justice, my preferred strategy. Gender analysis and mainstreaming women's full and equal participation in decision-making on these matters would allow us to not only make best use of the talent that we have available, but deepen our understanding of our challenges. I want to reflect briefly on Minister Young, some comments he made in his contribution earlier today. But first of all, I want to say, Madam Speaker, that, Madam President, I'm sorry, that Minister Young talked about people only having guns to commit illegal acts. And I want to remind us that firearms licenses is something that people work very diligently at getting for all kinds of reasons. And so even persons with legal firearms for hunting purposes, for example, even those persons have the ability really to impact the extent of the violence and the illegal activities that we're experiencing in the country, because we do know that there is and has been for quite some time a thriving rental trade within the illegal market. And it has been established that a lot of the firearms that are used in illegal activities are sourced from people who have licenses to bear firearms. So that it's, I think as we look to, as the Minister of National Security, to try to understand and to deepen our understanding of this challenge, we must understand the different roles that people play and the different scenarios which complicate the situation of firearms misuse and firearms possession in Trinidad and Tobago. I think we need to deepen our understanding of this challenge, and a possible analytical tool that I would wish to advance is gender analysis, because it helps us to understand the fundamental philosophies and the cultural norms that direct the behavior of particularly men who use guns. Madam President, I want to suggest that our belief systems and social norms perpetuate a nexus between masculinity and militarism. And so many men like guns, both for legal and illegal use. And I think a lot of times, even in our attempts to respond to the high levels of gun crime and gun violence that we are experiencing in our society, we may be relying on a masculinist approach to security, in which, and I return to my language of resistance, in which man better man is what we are pursuing, so that as the criminal activities increase, then the response of the rest of us is increased fines, increased penalties, increase. On the other hand, what we have to come to terms with is the fact that these increases have not significantly altered the course of our development. And consequently, I want to return to my question about why are these amendments before us? We need to stop engaging in a war against crime or drugs or a war against all the things we have wars against, and invest instead in building an inclusive society that no one group therefore feels left behind, and begin a resistance because tough on crime policies and legislation rarely apply to the more privileged in society. And I think a lot of what we've done over time is to marginalize more and more those persons who have engaged in gun crime, and we have less remedial action, institutionalized and otherwise, to address their needs. And we need to return to the table on that one. In conclusion, Madam President, I wish to return to the matter of the Arms Trade Treaty, as I'm of the view that government is attempting to take measures in this bill and other pieces of legislation that I referred to earlier. It's the gang bill and the bail amendment bill and so on. And I think it's an attempt to ensure peace and security and sustainable development for all the citizens of Trinidad and Tobago. I think it's an attempt to contribute to international and regional peace, security, and stability. And I think it's an attempt to reduce human suffering and prevent and eradicate the illicit trade in conventional arms and to prevent their diversion. But these worthy goals cannot be achieved within the narrow confines of this particular set of amendments. As I return to my earlier point on the Arms Trade Treaty, which regulates the international trade in conventional arms, including small arms and light weapons, which we face every day with firearms, it also seeks to prevent and eradicate illicit trade and diversion. Trinidad and Tobago is a state party to the Arms Trade Treaty, which entered into force in 2014, and in accordance with international law, Trinidad and Tobago has a legally binding obligation to pass legislation to implement the provisions of the ATT in our jurisdiction. And therefore, the opportunity presented by this debate, Madam President, begs me to ask the question whether Trinidad and Tobago is contemplating taking action to pass legislation to give effect to its obligations, which flow from the Arms Trade Treaty in the near future, in order to combat the diversion of arms from the legal trade to the illicit trade, which cause our pain and our fear on a daily basis. Because we've not done so as yet, and it would be instructive if the Honorable Attorney General can respond to this question. This could be achieved, I submit, with suitable and not piecemeal legislation to domesticate the provisions of the ATT. We must aim to do the hard work, I think, Madam Speaker, and seek international cooperation and assistance under Articles 15 and 16, respectively, of the Arms Trade Treaty. And so, Madam Speaker, as I conclude, permit me to say that this complex issue of firearms possession, firearms misuse, the pain and the suffering that it unleashes on the entire population, I don't know that there's any place in this country that one can say that one feels sufficiently secure. There's a very high level of insecurity in our country, and we know that something has to be done, which makes it all the more difficult when one recognizes that we are not taking the time to sufficiently understand the issues and invest the time and the resources to do the right thing. This complex issue requires all hands on deck, Madam President, to manage and to solve. It requires the collective genius of all the peoples of Trinidad and Tobago, and I submit that there must be meaningful participation by civil society and the wider population in meeting this challenge. Incarcerating more people for longer periods of time cannot reduce or prevent gun possession or misuse if impunity reigns and social exclusion is the order of the day. I submit, Madam President, that legislation is important, that good law is important, but we are not likely to produce good law if we rely on rhetoric, intuition, and good intentions. The amendments and the rigorousness of the government's arguments suggest to me that the suite of programs, projects, policies, and legislation developed and implemented in the so-called fight against crime have not produced the intended results. Several reasons may be advanced for why we are where we are today, and perhaps we have not invested sufficient resources in the agencies that have responsibility for leading the charge in the war on crime, or that more training is needed for our frontline troops, or that policies change much too frequently, or a myriad of other reasons which have been articulated over time and which we are well aware of. But we are where we are, and I want to posit that this challenge is manageable. It is within our competence, and it has less to do with financial resources than we argue. We have not allowed ourselves to sufficiently understand the challenge before us. We have been so consumed with ridding our communities of these people referred to as pests, or marginalizing specific communities so that the criminality which these communities produce.
Senator Mutota, you have 5 more minutes.
Or marginalizing specific communities so that the criminality which these communities produce does not infect the rest of us. Or we are busy executing crime-fighting interventions to suppress the violence whilst promoting that it is the hearts and minds of residents of selected communities which must be changed. Or we invest in, and I return to my language of resistance, big macro development agendas in order to deepen our understanding of the issues, but more importantly, to demonstrate that we are doing something. Madam President, as I wrap, I wish to say that this legislation cannot and will not bring us the relief that we want as a society. It requires much more, but I think what it mostly requires is an honest commitment to steer our challenges squarely and to commit completely to developing a society in which each and every one of us, no matter where we come from, no matter what our background, no matter what our resources, can feel equally beneficiaries, can feel that we are equal beneficiaries of all that it is in this great land of ours, and I thank you.
Honorable Senators, please join me in congratulating Senator Mutota on her maiden contribution. Minister of Agriculture, Land and Fisheries.
Thank you very much, Madam President, for the opportunity to join in this debate on a bill for an act to amend the Firearms Act, Chapter 1601. And Madam President, I want to share 3 pieces of data that have always stuck with me. The first is to bring things in context. 1999, 20 years ago, was the last time we had a homicide rate in Trinidad under 100. So clearly things have gotten out of hand. The second piece of data is this. In January 2009, 10 years ago, in the 3rd week of January, I found myself in a Canadian city where there was a raging debate amongst the politicians. And the issue was that crime fueled by an illegal cross-border drug trade had gotten totally out of hand. And the murder rate was out of control. For 2008, this city of 3 million had 17 murders. And I reflected on the fact that the murder rate in Trinidad and Tobago in January 2009, by the 3rd week, was 22. Little Trinidad, 1.2 million plus, another 15,000 for now. Clocking 22 in the first 3 weeks of January, and these politicians sincerely debating and fighting on the issue of 17 murders for the 365 days of the previous year. And the third piece of data is this. In welcoming Dwayne Gibbs to Trinidad, I had written in the Express that he didn't stand a chance of success, and I spoke about this before. Dwayne Gibbs was coming from the city of Edmonton, where I knew he was coming from a third-level position in the Edmonton police force. He was the superintendent in charge of human resources. The homicide rate in Edmonton was 2 handfuls for the previous year. And I wrote in my closing line that no Canadian police officer in the history of Canada has ever showed up for work and found 3,000 unsolved murders on their desks. Dwayne Gibbs stood no chance. And if you believe that this single piece of legislation will solve crime, well, you have to think again. It fits into a series of things that are more than 2 decades old. These are the tricks we were supposed to be trying in 1999, when the signs were pointed upwards. And we don't have time to think. We have to act, but act against the tide. And there are several things we have to do, and I'll get to that. But this is one of them. And I was reflecting when I was thinking, long before we got to this debate, I was thinking about, and the older ones, and we don't have many, would remember. In 1979, there was a murder that made more the weeklies than the dailies. It was a young schoolgirl found murdered in a cane field. And the allegation was that she was raped by a PH driver, a man who belonged to a particular faith. And it made the Calypso, by the way. Shkontas take the number from 1979. If you go through the lyrics, it was drawn from that incident. And I remember I was a few years old, but old enough to hear and understand. And around the community, this issue of rape, and rape of schoolgirls and so on, and the dangers of PH was the thing they were talking about. And it took us about a few years after, before we had legislation to deal with that situation. And it took us now in 2019 to return to that legislation to make serious amendments. I grew up in the middle of the drug trade. I think you all know that. I come from a marijuana growing community. That is no secret. And it was only in 1991, having lived a significant part of my life already, that we enacted very onerous legislation to deal with dangerous drugs. And now when we reflect on it, some of us are thinking that these sentences are too onerous. And we need to have another look at it. And in fact, some of you are even thinking that this issue of marijuana needs to have a second look. Because there are things that we did in the 1991 legislation that we need to complete. Some of you think so. And that is what we do as legislators. We deal with the issues of the day, trying as much as possible to capture it in real time. But you will always find with sexual offenses, with drugs, always find yourself somewhat behind. And you have a lot of catching up to do. So that now it's guns. And I will tell you this. I always, when I think about guns and firearms and illegal guns and homicides, I always think about Toronto. And in the 1990s, the homicide rate in Toronto hit 100. It hit 500. And the single cause of that was the pervasiveness of handheld guns. And Canada, where the criminal law making function is federal, enacted some of the strictest controls on handguns. And so as a result of that, homicides across Canada, in Toronto in particular, declined significantly. So there is a case to be made for strict controls. But in listening to Senator Haynes, for example, in particular, we have to draw a difference between countries where you can buy a gun, where you have easy access to guns, and where the debate is about background checks and other things relating to the ability to own a gun, but there is no debate about the constitutional right to own one. And our country, where we have severe restrictions, including administrative restrictions, so how can you plow through 15,000 firearm license applications? But we do, in fact, have very significant restrictions on the ability to own a firearm legally. And this bill really in the main targets a different category, and that is the category of those who are in possession of firearms illegally. And how do we deal with that? I'll come to the bill and the 8 aspects of the bill I want to talk about. But we have to understand that we are not dealing here, yes, when we get to this issue of legal ownership of firearms, matters of the background check and so on, I'm sure that those will enter the picture. But this bill really addresses the illegal part of it, the people who, in the main, are using firearms without the legal authority to have it in their possession. And I want to just go back before I get back to the bill, to even in Canada, because you can't have these fixes are not permanent. Because what is being debated in Canada right now? Well, Canada has seen a steady increase in homicides, 509 in 2013. Keep Little Trinidad in mind, 2013, 509, a population of 34 million. That has gone to 660. And because maybe of the severity on the restrictions on handgun ownership and so on, from 2013 to 2015, the majority of those homicides were stabbing. So shooting was the number 2 cause of homicides. Shooting number 2, beating number 3. So that maybe one day, maybe as we place these strict measures for firearms, another group of legislators might be here debating legislation to deal with increasing the fines for possession of a knife and increasing the jail time for stabbing somebody. And number 4 in Canada is strangulation. So maybe holding somebody by the neck might get you a fine of $150,000 one day. Because these things are not fixed. But we have a problem in front of us, and we have to deal with it. And this is a matter of illegal gun possession, homicides, and statistics that just trend in a direction that we are not happy with, and we have to deal with it. I'll get to the effectiveness and some of what I've heard in terms of the effectiveness of the measures. I want to just point to Senator Haynes' contribution, and I'm happy that Senator Haynes found her way to the PNM's manifesto. I advocated it in a previous contribution, but I am sorry that, Senator Haynes, you went to the wrong place. Today was not the day to talk about the PNM's manifesto in relation to what we've done in relation to crime. Today was the day to say that this was the first government and the first Attorney General, my colleague, MP Faris Al-Rawi, to lay a legislative agenda. And it is a legislative agenda that you should have gone to, because when you look at the legislative agenda, and I'm responding to your claim that we've not done anything, the usual story. We've not done, the government ain't doing anything, this ain't gonna work. Instead of this, you should have bring this, that, and the other. I talked about that before. But on our legislative agenda for the 2015-2017 period, there were 26 pieces of legislation, relating to crime. Because we said that we will have everybody have used the phrase so far that my colleague, Minister of National Security, used today, multi-prong. And in this House, we deal with one prong. I said that before, and I heard my colleague, the Minister of National Security, repeat it today. None of us will go in a police car and go in search of the criminals and knock on a door and so on. We have to, this is the prong we're dealing with here. And what we've presented in the legislative agenda is 26 prongs relating to crime. I wouldn't go into all of it, but they sound familiar to you, Senator Haynes. Whistleblower, family, child, and children division, motor vehicle, bail amendment, evidence amendment, indictable offenses. We even had there abolition of trial by jury for firearm offenses. And we're halfway there, because we now have something called judge-only trials in the country, but the defendant must opt for such a trial. And perhaps we'll eventually come to the abolition of jury trials for firearms offenses and maybe other types of offenses. It doesn't matter. I am happy. I have always said I'm happy to work on UNC legislation, you know. And a series of civil asset forfeiture, anti-terrorism, mutual assistance, all of those things. So this is a prong. We are here today on a prong. And there were 26 pieces of legislation relating to crime, much of which has kept us very busy in this House from September 2015. And in the second period, 17 to 19, we had one, but a lot from the first period have rolled over. In the third period, we have none listed. We have none listed. Some may roll over. And whatever we don't get done in this 5-year period, when we do our next legislative agenda for 20 to 25, we may have improvements. We may have improvements on some of them. So that is Senator Haynes. That is Senator Haynes. But I want to say, Madam President, I want to say that almost all the senators so far have been on point, have made contributions that I can't help but support. I find nothing really objectionable. I mean, all senators who were relevant, which means that I'm not speaking about Senator Obika. All senators who were relevant. I found the contributions of Senator Sobers. I told them that, Senator Sobers and Senator Hussain, to be very helpful. And I just want to address those contributions. The first is in relation to Senator Sobers. He's made several points, but two that struck me. And one has to do with this situation. I believe Senator Folade Mutota raised the issue of employees handling ammunition at a particular site, and my colleague Senator Sobers also talked about people who are involved in training involving firearms and ammunition, and his concerns in relation to some of what is in the bill, and I'm sure the Attorney General. But the other one relates to the existing clause which appears onerous, using the example that you used with hunters, because in the hunting environment, except that this 13A is restricted to trespass in a building. If it was trespass on land, I would have said it is extremely onerous. Of course, we do in fact have that amendment to the Trespass Act, which increases the penalty for trespass to land without reasonable excuse. But in this case, it relates to a building. But I'm sure that the AG will address your concern, but I take note of it. It is a valid point that it is possible that somebody who legitimately has a firearm may find themselves in a situation where the outcome may not be something that is desired in the amendment. But I just want to make the point that that provision exists. What is being done is that we're increasing the fines. The bill, madam, and I accept what my colleagues have said in relation to enforcement. But again, I've always said we have to leave it to the Trinidad and Tobago Police Service. There's a lot of things I could say about the Trinidad and Tobago Police Service, but I've said sufficient about the Trinidad and Tobago Police Service. But what they've asked us to do is to give them the tools. And I agree that criminals don't do a cost-benefit analysis and arrive at a point where they say, well, these fines are not affordable, and we have to get out of business. I accept that. It was beautifully put across. But in relation to acting as a deterrent, my own view as a legislator is if this amendment causes a few criminals to be disincentivized, then I feel I would have done my job. And if this incentivizes, I can't see it as an incentive to the police. The police, I believe they have a responsibility. But if the police believe that this will take some people off the street or allow them to take some people off the street, I believe I would have done my job. But the other thing about it is that I don't think anybody has addressed, and I think there is a lot of value. Now, you may disagree, and I don't fault you for disagreeing with the levels of the increase, because these are big numbers. The levels of the increase and the jail time, it's significant. But the one part of the bill that I personally like is the progressive nature of it, in the sense that it addresses first offenses, second offenses, and beyond second offenses. And it becomes more and more onerous as you progress. You could argue, and it's fair enough to argue, that the first offender should not be treated as harsh as the bill proposes that they be treated. You may make a case for that, but I'm sure that you'll agree that the proposal, where it does not currently exist, of having a first, second, and further offense, is a good direction for legislation of this nature. If it has to be a deterrent, I will accept that. We could, in committee, we could debate whether in relation to the first offenses that we are excessive. But when we get to beyond the second offense, I think we now have a career criminal and a gun toter and a shutter, as they say in my community. I think that is the moment when we have to really take action. And we have always said that this piece of legislation, this amendment, works with the bail amendment that some of us in this House supported and some did not. And we wait to see what happens in the other place. It does not work on its own. Madam President, there are 8 headings, as I would call it, in this bill. And it is very important that we focus on the 8 categories as I have set them out from my own understanding. And the first is that the bill goes to Section 4, subsection 3 of the existing Act on the issue of possession. And on this issue of possession, there are 3 three categories of possession, but I'll deal with two in this way. The first is the possession in relation to the existing requirement that you must have an FUL in order to possess a firearm or ammunition. And the bill seeks to increase the fines and the prison terms applicable for those who are found to be in possession without having a firearm, and that is possession of a firearm and ammunition. Now there's a second element of possession which deals with a prohibited weapon. And that second element, in the first case in relation to someone who is in possession without an FUL, the proposal is that the fine be increased to 500,000 and the applicable prison term for a first offense to 500,000. And then it increases progressively. And in the case of possession of a prohibited weapon, an existing offense, the proposal is to increase the fine to up to $1 million and 15 years in prison for summary conviction and 25 years on indictment. And on both of these now carry first and second and beyond second offenses. So that is in relation to possession.
Senator Rambharat, could you refer to the section of the bill which you're...
I'm referring to clause 3 of the bill, which seeks to amend section 6 of the Act. And section 6 deals with possession. In the 6.1 deals with possession. I may have said 4.1, sorry. 6.1 of the Act, which deals with possession of a weapon having a FUL and possession in sub 6.2 of a prohibited weapon. The second heading, as I call it, deals with sale of firearm or ammunition. And this is where we start trying to deal with what currently exists in the country. Persons who sell firearms, people who sell ammunition without having the authority to do so. And again, creating, in relation to these offenses, a first offense and a second offense, and again, more onerous fines and onerous jail term. And in relation to this one, which seeks to amend, I'm talking about clause 5 of the bill, which seeks to amend section 9 of the Act. We see the introduction in 5A of a conviction on indictment for a third or subsequent offense, an imprisonment for the remainder of his natural life. And we've heard submissions on this issue of remainder of natural life. We've heard submissions on it being onerous. We've heard the constitutional submissions, and in discussions with the AG earlier, and I know that the AG intends to deal with that. But I would say this in relation to what Senator Hussain said in his last 9 minutes today. I think as legislators, we ought to be concerned about the constitutionality of what we do, but I don't think that it should prevent us from passing legislation that we believe is constitutional, that we believe could pass muster and meets the requirement. I accept your argument, but I don't think as a legislator, once I am satisfied that it is required, it is proportional, it meets the requirements, that I'm going to be too concerned about a judiciary striking it down later on. That is why we have separation of powers, and we each have our job to do. But I accept that it raises, as it has done in the past, a constitutional issue. The third area, and this is perhaps my best part of this bill. This is the part when we worked on this bill. I had a lot of attraction to this. But I will say this: it is the area that caught my attention first, and I did in fact speak to the AG and the technical people because I raised it. I saw it having consequences in my community, for example, because I am not involved in law enforcement, but I am involved. I was born and I grew up in Southeast Trinidad, and I've seen a lot of things happen. And it is not unusual. Many households have a sort of shotgun about 300 feet behind the house somewhere. And many people in that part of the community would have handled a trap gun or set up a trap gun. And one of the things that struck me when I saw this trafficking was that I'm not saying they're right to do that. I'm not saying they're right to do that at all. But I know that it is not, I wouldn't say pervasive or endemic, but I know it is in a significant number of households that we have this. And I don't want to use the excuse that it is cultural, but I will say that it is all related to hunting. And in some cases, in defense of marijuana cultivations. And I thought that when we got down to the definition of firearm, which is not only a handgun, which also includes parts of it, I saw the opportunity for people, I don't want to say innocently, but for people to be caught in this thing called trafficking without really having an intent to be engaged in the trafficking of firearms for criminals to use to commit crimes and homicides and so on. I just thought about that, and I thought openly, and I expressed my concern that I was very concerned that we were not putting a section of the society at severe risk in order to deal with a problem that exists elsewhere. But over a period of time, I accepted that people have to follow the law, and the trafficking in firearms, whether you are a boatman bringing it in, whether you are an offloader offloading it, whether you're a customs officer turning a blind eye, or an immigration officer or a police officer or whoever turning a blind eye or whatever, I think that this 9A that is proposed is really a significant addition to the legislation. And I believe that it is something that, as I say, I thought long about it. I thought about the implications. We went through it, and it's something that I found comfort in being absolutely necessary if we have to deal with these people who bring in. I've heard the talk about importers, the people who bring in, handle, store. You pay some money for them to keep guns for you, and all those sorts of things. I think that this, recognizing also that those people who have reason and who have the authority to have more than one firearm are also at the same time protected under the law. The fourth area I want to draw attention to seeks to amend Section 10(1) of the existing legislation, and that is this thing called possession with intent to sell. And this is at Clause 7 of the bill, and seeks to amend 10(1) of the Act. And this offense requires a few things to be present. One is that you must have possession of a firearm or ammunition, and ammunition. You must have possession. You must have the intent to sell. And then the third element is that the intention to sell is to sell to someone who, for the purpose of committing a crime, whether it is a crime under this act or a crime under some other piece of legislation. And again, this is what we're trying to address, and this is what we're trying to, on one hand, disincentivize or make it a little more unattractive to those who engage in this type of conduct, and two, increase the jail time so those who do in fact engage in this conduct are facing the potential penalty that will keep them off the streets for a significant amount of time, and you can argue, we could discuss rehabilitation and all those things, but this is not for somebody who accidentally finds a spent shell and puts it in their pocket. And this is not for somebody who is thinking about a life of crime. This is somebody who is actively engaged in providing guns and ammunition to persons who they know are involved in crime or who are intent on the commission of a crime. And that is why the penalties and the jail times are being increased. But again, it is split between those who are convicted for a first offense and those who are convicted for a second or subsequent offense. And the proposed penalties reflect the difference in a first offender and somebody who is a repeat offender. Thank you, Madam President.
Honourable Senators, it is appropriate to suspend the sitting at this stage. We will return at 5:31 p.m. and Minister, you have utilized 33 minutes of your speaking time.